Amen. It's wonderful to be here with you today. Cisco Walker, an evangelist here in the beloved International District. And today we are going to be talking about rebellious youth is on the rise. Or is it? Right? This is this topic we're phrasing in the form of a question. I have Pastor Alonzo Garcia, New Life Church of God, with me again. It's always wonderful to sit down and try to hash these ideas out. I've chosen Deuteronomy 21. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 through 21. This is the thought division of the rebellious son. So Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18 says this: If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city. And they shall say to the elders of his city, This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. So tonight we're talking about rebellious youth. And rebellious youth is on the rise, or is it? You know, recently APD Police Chief Harold Medina stated that violent crime, particularly among the younger generation or the youth, is on the rise. You know, some believe that this is a perennial error, right? In other words, a pattern that simply repeats itself throughout history over and over again. So, what do you think about this question tonight as it concerns the city of Albuquerque, the metro area, the youth in general here in America, that the rebellious youth is becoming more violent, more evil, more brutal? Are they really becoming that way, or has this something that has just always existed?
Well, Cisco, thank you for having me. I really do enjoy digging into these topics. Because sometimes it's important for us to say the quiet part out loud. I did some research in preparation for this topic, and I frankly was a bit surprised by the data. There is a statement in data that says data is ambivalent. Data management, data is ambivalent. Data doesn't care. It just represents whatever it represents. And so I think that the statement from Chief Medina, while I'm not going to say he's a liar, I'm going to say he's got it all wrong, I think that it is really narrow in its perspective, particularly in the United States at large. Because the data shows that that is not true.
Right.
So I think that it probably feels like it, right? Like I don't do police work. I don't keep track of how many people I've arrested in a year. I am not investigating crimes. I am not seeing, directly firsthand the violence. I'm not writing or, reports about it, making presentations to the city council. So maybe I am less biased. But it does appear to me that there is an element of a logical fallacy, recency bias, confirmation bias, a couple others.
Logical fallacy.
Yeah, there are some logical fallacies, meaning he thinks he's right because of what he believes is in front of him, right? And so that's the challenge with a logical fallacy. And so, when we get around to it, I did jot some of those statistics that I had looked up. That I'd looked up down, looking at that verse in Deuteronomy.
It seems kind of like I put that verse out there for like a shock value, because if people aren't careful, especially older people, especially unchurched people, especially bitter and resentful people, like people can read that verse and they can be like, whoa, I wish we could go back to that again. Because if we could go back to that again, then we could clean up these streets. If we could go back to that again, we could get these youths by the scruff of their neck and we could clean up this town. We could clean up this world. If we could just go back to that, I wish we could just go back to that again. Because this verse is one of those cringy verses. This verse can be taken out of context, which if you just read it the way that I actually read it, it actually is taken out of context. It has many ties to prodigal son, all kinds of things, but a lot of people salivate and they'd love to go back to this time period. And this verse actually shows us, the Bible is roughly 6,000 years old, 5,000 years old, maybe even older. So these problems have existed since the inception of time.
Sure. Yeah, I am pro-life, right?
Yes.
And I don't believe in, I can't tell someone what to do, but I don't support abortion, right? But I also don't support aborting those that are already born. And that's what that passage is often used to support, right? Like, these people are worthless. The fact that you refer to them as these people, right? Cleaning up the streets.
Yeah, and I said that
rid of the scum.
in the guise of,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But people say that and really mean it.
Yeah, they do. And Christians say it, and they really mean it as well. So those are things that we have to be careful with. So why is it so common among the older generation to gravitate towards the idea that the younger generation is more evil? The younger generation is more violent. The younger generation is more dangerous. And the younger generation is more depraved than the previous generation.
So I work in an office building, and there's an elevator and there's stairs. And for years, I'm not in the greatest of physical health, but I try and take the stairs, right? I don't park close, so I can walk. I take the stairs, not the elevator, because it's good for me. But the older I get, the more I worry when my heel drags on a step that I'm going to fall and break a hip. And I think maybe as we get older and we start to face some of our own mortality, I think there is that sort of response that is just a natural outflow. We become afraid of things that didn't bother us before, whether we were, thought we were bulletproof when we were kids, right? Or we just didn't understand the gravity that comes from hurting yourself, like falling down the stairs, right? Like, as a kid, I've fallen down the stairs and I was fine. I'm 52.
Yeah,
it's trying to fall down the stairs.
It's going to be like much different.
And that's,
if you fall now.
That's a logical fallacy as well. It's recency bias. It's the things that have happened most recently to me that affect me the way that something in my own present life would affect me. So I struggle with that same logical fallacy. And so I think that's why older folks are going to look at the youth and say it's so much worse than it ever was. We're so much better at killing each other today than we ever were before. That's not exactly great.
Yeah, and the Bible tells us, Ecclesiastes 1:9, right? What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun, right? And I'm not making a claim that the Bible is the only manuscript. I'm not making the claim that the Bible is the only manuscript that has the answers to all our problems. However, Scripture does help us understand that these problems have always been here, and they will always be here because there is no utopia. And I think that when men and women, whether they're churched or whether they're unchurched, whenever we strive to create utopia is when things like this rebellious son begin to take place, like in the book of Deuteronomy. Whenever we strive to make utopia, we want to get all of the proverbial weeds out of the way, and we want to do people in. We want to be the person that hands out justice. We want to be the people that execute judgment, and I think that's very dangerous. But the pattern of youth, and this is why we're going to be using tonight as well a majority of our thoughts that are going to come from Scripture, and they're going to come from Clockwork Orange. And why would so many Christians have a problem saying, well, how in the world could you use a book like Clockwork Orange to demonstrate biblical principles? Why do so many evangelicals have a problem making that connection?
It comes back to
Because that's a big deal, you know.
It is, but it's a topic you and I have discussed before. People are afraid of knowledge, right? Like they don't really want to learn anything. They just want to parrot things. They'll read Max Lucado, they'll read C.S. Lewis, but in reading C.S. Lewis, they'll get to the screw tape letters and it rattles them.
Yeah.
Right? And so some of those same folks are obsessed with, World War II or, studying serial killers or any number of things, right? And people have the habits that they have.
Most evangelicals, or especially pastors, they're not going to look at serial killers. But I get your point.
Well, I
don't know any of them
yeah,
interesting that would dare to look into that. I'm not saying that's healthy, but I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Though. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, they have obsession with things that
maybe they do it secretly.
Yeah, the people at Netflix and all those subscription services grow for a reason.
Yeah.
So here's just a little bit of data, just as we're sort of talking about things. Like I went back to 1960, right? I was born in 72. So in 1960, someone born in 1960 would have been 12. That's sort of that age of, accountability that we would see in the Bible and looking at it from an Old Testament perspective. So 1960, 11% of kids didn't have a parent, were single parent homes with absent fathers particularly. By 2010, that number had grown to 27%, right? So in 50 years, it had grown to 27%. But today, that number is below 27%. Now, some of that is there's not as many people having children.
Okay.
Right? And so, there is a piece of data that if you look at it from one perspective, you can make, and it might be a false cause, but you can say that, there are 25% of our kids today grow up in single parent, specifically absent father homes. What kind of impact does that have on crime? Well, another piece of data is that from 2019 to present, there have been the fewest number of youthful arrests under 18, 696,620 in 2019. There have been the fewest in 4 decades. So going back to 1979, right? So it's 1960 to 1979, those 20 years. In 2019, 6 years ago, that number was the lowest it had been in 4 decades.
Yeah. All right. Well, I can tell you from my childhood, from my pre-adolescence, like I grew up here in Albuquerque. I went to elementary school in the North Valley, and there was some kids that were. My grandmother lived on a dead-end street over by Hogadas. That's when Hogadas was actually there for troubled kids. Remember that, like in the 80s?
Yeah.
So they lived by. She lived on Belrose Avenue. It was a dead-end street, and I remember, growing up. On Belrose Avenue, and there was a group of young kids, right? And these young kids, like, they lived at the end of the dead end street,
right.
And they had taken the dead end sign, and they had turned it into Dead Kennedys. And I remember they had a tree house, and it had corrosion of conformity.
Oh, yes, CUC.
And they were smoking pot, they were doing drugs, they were drinking. I remember for Halloween they would dress up as the Warriors with the baseball. Because
my stars!
Well, they had all been in baseball, so they had, so they would walk around trick or treating. I don't really know if they were trick or treating. I think they were bag snatching and bullying kids.
Right.
But they were dressed up with the makeup on, like the movie the Warriors. Mm-hmm. Right. And like I remember these kids, and like there was the punk rock affiliation. But I remember like those kids were always there. Mm-hmm. And I remember like we were always told, stay away from them by the adults. Stay away from those kids. Those kids are going bad. They're troublemakers. They're getting into trouble. And like the adults were right, because I remember in just a couple of years' time, like one of those kids, like I remember like some houses started getting broken into, and like graffiti with oi and like skinhead stuff started like popping up. And then I remember watching this young man. He was older than me, but like he began to change. And like I remember like he was into breakdancing and like all that kind of stuff, wore the parachute pants, kind of had the pompadour hair. But I remember that once he started really getting into that punk rock counterculture, like I remember seeing him like mowing the lawn, and like his head, and he was Hispanic, but his head was shaved. He had red suspenders on. He wore the boots and the braces. And like I remember those kids, like they were getting into trouble all the time. They severely they attacked. There was a 7-Eleven right there on the corner. Yep. Now it's a coffee shop, and I remember that one of those kids, he was a juvenile, and he went into that 7-Eleven and he punched the lady in the face. Then he went back home, got a baseball bat, came back, damaged the store, broke it all to pieces. And those young boys, it was rumored for years that like they had connections to Carlos the Ragman Garver's death. Remember, he was a street person who was these troubled youth. They poured accelerant on him and lit him on fire and burned him to death. And like there was never really nobody really knows who did it. I mean, somebody was charged, but it was a juvenile crime. So like some of these things, like I remember these things as a kid, like as a 9, 10 years old, watching this cycle happen. But like here's the thing, it didn't happen to every teenager that lived on that street, but it did happen to some. Sure. And so when I read about Alex, Pete, George, and Dim, like it's easy for me to conceptualize that, because like I didn't kind of grow up in a normal setting, and like I remember those things. I remember when those kids started getting into trouble, when the houses started getting broken into, people were getting beat up, and like there was like bad things happening. And but here's the key. That's what I love about Burgess, because Burgess talks about when Georgie, Pete, and Dim, when they go into the bar, right? Remember, and they give away all of their money because there's the old women that are in the bar and they need an alibi, right?
From a local bar.
Yeah, and the way that they're dressed. And then they talk about the girls that are in these places, and how like they're wearing the motley wigs, and their feature, the clothes and the lipstick that they're wearing, they accentuate their promiscuity, but at the same time they're still just kids, but they're doing these awful and terrible things. But it's always been like this. It isn't just something that just all of a sudden has come about just now in 2025, because I shared this with you a week ago. I was playing on the street corner at Central in Utah. I see two young men walking around, probably not even 21 years old, wearing ski masks, like the Ted Bundy ski mask, like broad daylight, and like you got to be careful with that. Yeah. You got to be careful with that, because like those kids are probably up to something. Like nobody walks around with a ski mask on, in the middle of the day. in a drug-fueled and a prostitution-filled neighborhood.
Right.
Like a young man that's in that predicament, that's walking around with a ski mask on, like the wheels are turning, and like you've got to pay attention to things like that.
Yep. Yeah, as I was getting some of this stuff ready and going over notes, I was thinking, my son plays soccer, right? And like he's a good kid, right? Tender-hearted kid. But like he doesn't face playground violence like we faced. Like, and please hear me out. It was a terrible name, but there was a game that was like dodgeball. They called it Smear the Queer, and it's a terrible name.
Oh, yeah.
I get it. Like
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's okay, but like you literally, it wasn't just like trying to hit somebody, or it wasn't like literal dodgeball. It was like, let me exact violence upon you with, and those, you remember those balls, right? The red balls?
Yeah.
Like those things would leave a terrible mark on you.
Yeah.
And like I grew up playing that. Like sometimes you get hit and like you can't show emotion and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that is a violence that we don't have in this society. So like it's almost that violence, youth violence, used to be so normalized it was not seen as violent, and that we have, through social custom or maturity or the way that we engage with people, the way that we're kinder and gentler, and like we seem to look out for one another more, like we don't abuse kids on the playground in that same way. So when there is violence, it seems that it's larger than maybe it really is, because we don't live with that daily violence anymore.
Yeah, because I remember being a kid, and I remember being on the playground, and I remember being punched in the face and stuff.
Dude.
And I remember like my son, my oldest son, like trying to, he was interested in boxing for a while, and I said, okay. I said, you know what? I said you can try it. I said, but you know what? I said, like, you're gonna get hit in the face, and like you're not gonna like it, and like that's
great.
what that is.
Yeah.
And it's like it looks cool, it sounds cool now, but it's like you have a hard time getting hit with a baseball, and then you're gonna get hit in the face. Like it changes things, and it changes you, and going through that, going through those experiences. They're very traumatic, but they're like a part of life. But now, like, I think our kids, they face stuff with the social media, the trolls, these videos, like, so it's still there, they can still be embarrassed and shamed and humiliated, and and these things are so traumatic, they happen to kids, where it can drive them to like suicide, it can drive them into horrible deep depression, it can scar them and affect them for life, so it's moved from the playground more to like this kind of stuff with all of our narcissistic society. So there's nuances that have changed throughout the years, because I do remember those games, and I remember those same kids that were on my grandmother's street. Like, that was the first fight that I ever got into, because they lied and they wanted to see me fight. And so like I got in a fist fight with a little kid, and there was blood and everything. It was terrible, and but I wanted to impress them. Yeah. And I looked up to them, and I was like, well, these are adults, and if this is what they're doing, because you're so impressionable at that younger age. And it's so important to be, if you're a young person, when you're a young adolescent, that you're around the right type of people, because people can't twist your arm and make you do things, but we value and we care about what people think more than we like to admit, especially like when you're a kid. So this is what is so interesting about Burgess's book, is that they're doing all these things, but like, remember that he says here that he's doing all this stuff, and he's only 15 years old. Because if you watch the film, you see Malkovich, and Malkovich looks like he might be 19, 20. But when you read the book, you realize that Alex, George, Pete, and Dim, like, they're much younger.
Much younger.
And like they're doing really bad things, right? They're stealing cars, they're raping people, they're beating people, they're
murdering.
and they're doing awful, horrible things. And to them, it is fun. And there's no consequences really for it. And like, and so these patterns, this perennial error of, and that's one of the ways that you're getting old is when you think like these kids, you're turning into like Mr. Wilson, you're turning into this crotchety old man that doesn't want kids stealing cherries off of the cherry tree because you're turning into this rotten old bastard, and you see these kids as a nuisance, and and so like you always kind of, I think as an evangelical, you have to guard your heart against this. And like Medina can say those things, and I'm not for or against Medina. I'm kind of neutral for Medina. But when he makes statements like that, but I also understand that a man that has a badge, he has authority, and people listen to people like that. And that's one of the things, that's one of the major drawbacks to living in the 505, to living in the International District, watching Albuquerque Raw, watching Channel 7 and 4 all the time, is there's never anything good that comes on those news stations. But there's still good people in the city. Yeah. There's still good kids in the city. But you've got to be careful how you receive your information and who you receive it from.
Yep. Yeah, I don't watch any of those. I don't really watch TV. Like, I'm very selective about what I consume, and I tend to read more than I do watch. Like, I don't care what the weather is. Like, I figure out what the weather is when I walk outside.
Yeah.
Or if I happen to look out the window, I'm like, oh, there's snow on the ground.
Well, it's New Mexico.
Yeah,
it's not that drastic. Yeah.
It's not. But in that same regard, like, I also don't check the traffic before I hit the interstate, right? Or whatever I'm going. Like, if I end up running into a traffic jam, I don't hear about it on the radio. I don't hear about it on the news. I find out when, like, I'm like, oh, everybody's turning left. Right?
Yeah, like,
gotta get out this road.
This is kind of off subject, but what do you think about this? Why don't they go back to like old-fashioned police work? Like, start writing tickets, start pulling cars over that don't have tags. Like, we're the worst. We have the worst drivers in the United States. Whew. Like, why aren't they doing that? They want to worry about this and they want to worry about that. Like, people, they're all the cars, the distracted drivers, the DWI. Like, why don't they get back to that? Like, because like it's very dangerous to drive around the city of Albuquerque.
It's dangerous.
Look, I know it's dangerous everywhere, but like specifically here, like there's people that I know that have lived in California. They've driven in Europe, and they're like, "This is the worst place I have ever driven in my life." Like, when is APD going to go back and start like doing? Because like when I was on drugs and when I was doing all kinds of, when I was a total scumbag, like you couldn't get, like you were going to get a ticket. If you didn't have tags, they were going to take that car. They were going to impound it.
Yep.
What happened to that?
I don't know. I will say this, that my dad was a police officer back in the 60s.
Okay.
And like I hear the stories of like, it was always bare knuckle brawls on the weekends, right? Like it was just the way of life. And it's kind of, in keeping with what we saw growing up. But it's dangerous to pull someone over today. Like
it is.
If you're a law enforcement officer, I mean, like you pull someone over because you can't see through their tint, and like you can't see through their tint, and then they shoot you.
Yeah,
like,
and they will.
And they have. Like a friend of mine, a guy I know really, really well, in another county where we're from. He just celebrated the other day the 20th anniversary of him getting shot 11 times.
Yeah, here in the 505.
Yep. In another county, but yeah.
Yeah, or here in the state of New Mexico.
Here in the state of New Mexico.
Yeah.
And it's like, you sort of take a step back and you're like, 11 times and you walked away. Like,
yeah.
I can't imagine the post-traumatic stress. And he was sheriff's deputy and retired from the sheriff's department.
Yeah.
I mean, like this individual put in the time and dealt with the psychological trauma of getting shot 11 times. 11 times and left on the side of the road to die. He just didn't.
Yeah, awful. Now, we talked about Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 through 21, the rebellious son. Now, there's an interesting connection with our text and with Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange scene. Now, this is an awful scene in the book. Many people have a problem with the Clockwork Orange because in order to understand Ludovico technique, in order to understand free will, you have to paint the picture of how bad Alex and his droogs really are, or really were in a fictional sense. So many people are turned off, which is understandably because even Kubrick said the first 20 minutes of his representation of Anthony Burgess's novel, which I think you have to have the two hand in hand.
They go well together.
You need the two hand in hand. They complement each other. They're not at odds. They're not against each other. But that first 20 minutes,
Burgess would disagree.
Burgess would, but and that's fine. But you have to understand why he needs treatment. You have to understand the ugliness, the vileness, the awfulness. You have to understand that, or else there's no reason for him to be cured.
Totally understand.
And we'll get into some of that later. But this is one of the scenes where Alex and his droogs, they break in. They force entry into a house. They beat. There's a couple there. He's a writer, and they beat him half to death, and they rape his wife, and it's awful and terrible. But this is interesting. Tell me what you think about this. It says, then Georgie and Pete came in from the kitchen, both munching away. Though with their maskies on, you could do that with them on and no trouble. Georgie with like a cold leg of something in one rooker, that's a hand, and half a loaf of Kleb with a big dollop of Maslow on it in the other, that's plum cake, and Pete with a bottle of beer, frothing its Gulliver off, and a horror show rooker full of like plum cake. Right? So right there, you see the sign of drunkard and gluttony. That is there for a reason. That is there for a purpose. And I think that Christianity, these concepts of a drunkard and a glutton, like the reality and the testimony of Jesus Christ is so strong and so prevalent in our culture, in our society. And it's brilliant how it's put into this story with these young men as drunkards and gluttons. But the interesting thing about that is that Alex, clearly Georgie and Pete in the living room, cake and beer is a reference to a drunkard and a glutton. It's true that some of today's youth are filled with decadence, right? With the turkey leg or whatever. The youth are filled with decadence and alcohol, pot, fentanyl, and it's just amazing to me how Burgess was able to put this in there. Christianity has a place in literature, in film, in our all the way down intrinsically to our thought process, whether you believe in Christ or not. And I marvel at the beauty and the brilliance of that. So it's so awful, like the things that these boys are doing. But we're seeing more and more of these youngsters, like Georgie, Pete, and Dim, like the rebellious son. We're seeing more and more of these people, these young kids, young men and young women. I see more and more and more of them on the streets of Albuquerque than I used to. Or maybe I'm just getting older. What do you think?
So you're saying you see more of these ham-fisted, two-fisted, grabbing onto things in the world. That's what you're describing?
I'm seeing more and more kids, it seems, younger kids who are out on the streets of Albuquerque, who are addicted to fentanyl, who are hooked on drugs, who are unhoused, who are homeless. I'm not saying that violent crime is on the rise, particularly among young people, but people that we know, like Pastor Chuck, the Pope of the International District, Joanne Landry, they all testify that the crowds are younger now than they were 10 years ago.
So
what do we do with that?
Yes, well, there's a couple things that I wanted to touch on, and I'll work my way backwards. Yes, there are more younger and older people who are unhoused across the board. Now, if you were to go back 10, 15 years, it wasn't always seen as true homelessness if mother or father raising kids in a single parent household went to live with their parents. That still qualifies under the designation of homeless, right? It's the same thing. The challenge that we've had, and this is going back to 2008 and prior to that, there was a major economic recession in 2008. That economic recession caused the cost of housing, interest rates, from an economic standpoint, right? I'm not an economist, but from an economic standpoint, the cost of inflation and the cost of interest rates are inverse, right? So they operate differently, right? So when people don't have any money and you're trying to get them to borrow money, you have to lower interest rates. If the interest rates are too high, it negatively impacts inflation, right? So that's what we have the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, who's been in the news, because he's drug into the news by the nature of his job. That's where that discussion comes from. So we can't say that 2025 happens in a vacuum, because 17 years ago, you see younger kids, 17 years ago, people were impacted economically on a scale that hadn't happened in many years. And it cost people housing. We had, most very recently, at the onset of COVID, the cost of lumber, right? Because people weren't cutting trees. Lumber rose exponentially. And so what you used to be able to pay for housing, say, and I'm going to put some numbers out there. If a house in Albuquerque, like this one here, this house would have cost $120,000 in 2020. A house like this now is going for $350,000. Like, that is not a small increase. And so the cost to build a home went, like, a 1,500, 2,000 square foot home, went from like 60 to 80,000 to 150 to 210,000. Like, just the cost of making things went up. Now, the stuff that happened in 2008, it wasn't just in 2008 that things got bad. It was the years leading up to it. And it wasn't fixed by 2009. It was the years following it. And you've heard people saying, and they're not necessarily wrong, again, I'm not an economist, that we are on the verge of different market collapses, whether it's a housing market, whether it's a stock, bond, treasury market. Tariffs are impacting. Like, things are more expensive. And when things are more expensive, people can't afford things. And so they end up, unhoused. Again, I'm not an economist. Minimum wage. Federal minimum wage is not a livable wage, right? $7.65 an hour. It hasn't gone up in 20 years, right?
Yeah.
In New Mexico, minimum wage is $12 an hour. Now, I'm not an economist, but I have been a business owner, right? And so if I own a business and I go from having to pay someone who is producing minimum wage work, I can no longer pay them $7.65. I now have to pay them $12 an hour. Somebody has to pay that cost.
Yeah.
And so it gets passed on to the consumer. Things are more expensive. People can't afford them. And that applies to housing. So sometimes you're like, do I buy food or do I pay for a place to live?
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. The other part of it, like you're talking about, the gluttony and one of the things that drives me insane is like plastic that gets just disposed of, like glitter, right? Glitter is the most garish sign of false wealth that exists in the world that we live in today. You go down to the dollar store, whatever store of the dollar variety you want to name, and you can buy these plastic glittery shiny things that project false wealth that end up all over the environment and in our very bodies.
Oh yeah.
Right? And so, like, we are just so tone deaf to the kind of gluttony that we live in, that we want so desperately to be rich in our poverty, right? Let him who says he is rich realize that he is poor, right?
Yeah,
You're destitute. Come and buy bread from me instead, right? Like we live in such a tenuous balance between housed and unhoused, and all of us are a paycheck away from
being
where we,
Well, it's a shadow now that looms over every family.
Well, that's why you have more unhoused people,
and it's a shadow that looms over. Even my kids. They've grown up being kind of. I know that they think about it. Like, are we going to wind up on the concrete outside? Are we going to wind up
over there?
Yeah. Are we gonna have a place to live? Like, what are we gonna do? Like, So, like, I never worried about that when I was their age, but I know that they worry about that now because the world has changed so much. Now, as people get older, they tend to feel less valued.
Yep.
They tend to feel less respected.
Yep.
From the youth.
Yep.
And they're actually afraid of the youth.
Yes.
Right? So this happened to me. There was some kids from Wilson Middle School. And these little guys were skipping school. They were ditching school, and they were on the news. They tried to shoot somebody actually, and I think they put him in YDDC. But they were skipping school, right? They were skipping school at Wilson, and they were coming over, and they were hanging out in the stairwells instead of being in school. And and they were running amok, and they were running through the apartments, and they were.
This is where you are now.
Yeah, over there
in the
by the gateway.
Yeah.
And they were running up and down the hallways, and they were taking people's Amazon packages off the. Because Amazon would just come and just put it in the hallway, and so.
Where else are you gonna put it?
Yeah, and they were, and then they threw some rocks and broke out some windows of some of the tenants, and I remember that they were hanging around on the stairwell, and I don't remember what I was doing, but I could hear them like hanging around on the stairwell, and so like I knew that they didn't live there. And this was when we really had to pay attention where I lived, because there was a guy that was breaking into cars, and he broke into a bunch of cars, and like he kept doing it, and he kept doing it
inside the gated.
Yeah, and he kept getting away. So like everybody was on alert, and they had pictures and everything, trying to find this kid who was breaking into cars, because like your car could be next. And so we were supposed to like report any strange people, and like these little guys were out there on the stairwell, and I remember I went out there, and I said, hey, what are you guys doing? I said, you guys live here? And I remember this little kid, and he was all, F you, buddy, man, man. He was all, you don't want me to get mad, And but for just a moment, like I was like. I felt kind of afraid, and then I had to remember who I was, how old I was, what I'd been through.
Right.
And then I remembered, like, he's just a little kid.
Yeah.
But the vibrato, the braggadocious, the gall, the already trying to intimidate, and like, just a few months later, these little guys were ditching school. They had a gun, and they shot at this kid, and they put him all in juvenile hall. So like, it is a real thing.
Yep.
So, but like older people, like they are afraid of the youth. And this is where we have the scene in Clockwork Orange where the old man is drunk in the alley.
In the alley.
And and they're going to roll a drunk, right? Yep. And this is what he says. He says, go on, do me in, you bastard cowards. I don't want to live anyway. Not in a stinking world like this one. I told Dim to lay off a bit then, because it used to interest me sometimes to sloshy what some of these starry decreps had to say about life in the world. And I said, oh, and what's so stinking about it? He cried out, it's a stinking world because it lets the young get onto the old like you done. And there's no law, no order, no more.
Yep.
There's a lot of people that are like that, you know?
That scene in the movie is among the best, right?
Yeah.
Because you see Malcolm McDowell playing that part, and I mean, he's just so good at it. The drunk, not as great. The lighting is, it's 1972, right? The lighting
he sticks a
isn't
cane
great.
in his sternum.
Yeah.
But
But the way that Malcolm McDowell plays that character, that scene in particular, the way his character is, irrespective of everyone else, really well executed.
Yeah,
scene.
and he doesn't like him because remember he says there's one thing I can never stand. Is to hear an old drunkie howling away at the moon, the songs of his forefathers, like a disgusting orchestra gurgling up in his rotten guts.
Yep.
And he's like I could never stand to see anyone like that, but especially one as old as this one.
Yep.
And those are awful things, but that's one of the ways that you're getting older. But we also have to remember when we were younger.
Yep.
When I was younger, I didn't want any old people around. When I was younger, the only people I wanted around that were older than me, unless they were cool or they were doing drugs or they could buy me alcohol, pot, or drugs. I remember when I was in high school, I dated girls that were already over 21. And it didn't really matter what they looked like because I knew they could buy me alcohol. I knew they could get me drugs. Because I was a rotten little bastard. I was a bad little kid, So we have to kind of remember that. Like what we used to be. You remember the old mantra, never trust someone over the age of 30. I took my boys to the mall a couple of weeks ago, right? And I felt bad for them. And I told my wife, I said, we can't take them anymore. And she was like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, "They're too old." I was all, "They're too old and we're too old."
Yeah.
I said, "I can't be walking around in there with a bunch of, middle school." And I said, "I feel like a fool, And I said, "We're embarrassing them."
Right.
I said, "We're just going to drop them off from now on, and just let them, they have to grow up and they have to figure these things out, and we can't incubate them and, we can't coddle them to death. We can't be that black widow that just looms over their child and tries to keep every bit of danger and every bit of the awfulness of the world, or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of Christians, they totally disagree with that. But I remember when I was a kid and I would go places with my family, and I was a hard-hearted little bastard. I remember the embarrassment and stuff, and a parent will say, "Oh, well, I love him or I love her." Well, you have to love them enough to kind of let him go and kind of let them have their own time with their own friends, and and sometimes that can be hard and difficult because of the world that we live in. But we have to come to a place where you have to let go a little bit.
Yep.
Right? So let's talk about Alex's parents, right? Because Alex's parents, they're afraid of their own son.
Oh,
they're horrified of their own son, and that is actually a picture of a lot of families now. Because Alex gets whatever he wants. Remember, he comes. They don't question where he's been.
Nope.
They don't question what time he comes in.
Nope.
He could come in with blood all over him. He could come in disheveled. He could come in any kind of condition. And what does he do? The minute he comes in, he likes to play Beethoven on his stereo.
Yep.
And he said P&M. No, he said my mother and father. He says they don't bother me anymore. He said I've trained them.
Yep.
I've shown them. He's all, now they take sleeping pills. That way I can play my music as loud as I want any time of the day or night. They're not going to knock on my door. They're not going to bother me because they're afraid of him.
Yeah.
How many parents are afraid of their kids now?
Probably a lot. And there's a mix, right? There's sometimes the abusive parent that is afraid of receiving what they've sown, right?
Yeah.
And then there are kids that are clearly troubled, like Mr. DeLarge is, and those parents, they just don't know what to do. They're at a loss for how to bring about any sort of resolution. They don't really know how to handle the behavior. They wouldn't know the first thing about any sort of reconciliation for the challenges that they're facing.
Yeah.
They have no idea. what
And
to
there's
do.
certain parents, I think Alex's parents were kind of like that. This was a joke we used to have when I was a kid, where your parents would say, "Oh, not my angel,
Right.
not my angel.
Right.
He's not out there throwing cinder blocks off the overpass onto cars on the
Right.
freeway. Not my angel, not my kid."
Right.
You'd be surprised what your kids will do.
You'd be surprised.
Yeah, you'll be surprised how they'll get in trouble. Because I remember when I was a teenager, like I got in a lot of trouble. I wound up in juvenile hall. I was drunk, criminal damage to property. I mean, we were doing things not quite as bad, but without the grace of God, like we probably would have. But we were not like normal, ideal children at all, or adolescents.
Have there
we
ever
were
been?
terrible?
I mean, do you think the Vikings had normal
Yeah.
children? I mean,
Well, Deuteronomy shows us that all, like, you can't go too much further back than that.
yeah,
Right?
You really can't.
So let's look at this as we get ready here to kind of shut it off for time being. What is the cause, or what is the root effect of violent youth? And we're going to kind of like debunk these. Many people say the broken home will cause the youth to go bad or to spoil. But Alex DeLarge has two supposedly loving parents. But the question is, do they really love him? Do they really know him? Do they really care enough about him to deal with the problems, deal with the issues, or do they really love him, or do they just let him do whatever he wants? Because, if we're honest with ourselves, Dostoevsky says that love is a harsh and dreadful thing at times, and it's hard to confront all of these issues and all of these problems. It's easier to let your kids do whatever the hell they want to do.
Yeah.
But his home isn't broken.
No, his home isn't broken, but that in and of itself cannot be the barometer.
But
That's
they've used
not the
that
measuring
for
stick.
30 years.
Of course, they've
Yeah.
used it for longer than that, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So a mentor of mine says this: when a child learns authority before they learn their identity, you sow seeds of rebellion.
That's good.
And so when a child learns the lack of authority, right, before they learn their identity, you end up with the same result. You let the kid do whatever they want, you end up with a kid that doesn't regard authority, right, and has the seeds of rebellion. I'm going to do whatever I want. Conversely, you present too much authority and no identity. Right? We, speaking from a Judeo-Christian perspective, it's what we talk about at New Life. It's what you and I talk about in lots of different settings. You have to know who you are in Christ. If you don't know who you are in Christ, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Now, you may come from a single-parent home. Like, we act like that's sort of like, the lack of conventional marriage. Like, that's the thing that broke
like
society.
Ozzie and Harriet.
Right. But yet, you have parents that have been separated by war. Like, in preparation for my message on Sunday, right, a denarius, a Roman soldier got paid $50 a day, a denarius.
Yeah.
The vineyard worker got paid $50 a day, a denarius. The difference between the two is that the vineyard worker had a significantly less chance of getting hit with a sharp object in the course of battle, right?
Yeah.
Like putting down a rebellion or something.
Yeah.
So, you have wars. Like the soil in Europe and the Middle East has been soaked in blood for millennia. Like, we've had broken homes, not because Daddy doesn't love me. Daddy might be laying dead on a battlefield somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? Or taken into slavery by some other nation. Like, those things happened.
Yeah.
Now, that's not the broken home. Well, Dad is an
Because
absent
we're looking at it through the American
Absolutely.
lens.
Absolutely.
And like people have played with those ideas. Like Oliver Stone played with that idea with Natural Born Killers
Yes.
when he did Mickey Loves Mallory.
Yep.
Right? And like that home wasn't broken.
Nope.
But like the father was molesting
Yep.
the daughter. The son was completely miserable. And some homes, they're not broken, but it would probably be better off if they were broken.
Yep.
But we have this black and white picket fence, American concept of the American dream and apple pie and all of that garbage. And like we think that our life is supposed to be patterned and modeled after that. And I think that's where that misconception of the broken home comes from.
Yep. Chicken in every pot and a car in every garage.
Yeah, some people say a Cadillac home. A brick home and a Cadillac in the driveway.
Yep.
And that is America, and that is the American dream. And if you don't have those things, then you're not You're not truly an American.
Yep.
You're certainly not a patriot, and something's wrong with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
and so these ideas are so interesting. Some of the cause and effects of the youth being violent and angry is the influence of certain types of music.
Mm-hmm.
But notice that Alex loves classical music.
Mm-hmm.
And that turns it upside down on its ear, because it's not necessarily the music itself.
Well, but if you were to go back, Beethoven was the heavy metal of his day.
Yeah, he was looked upon as a heretic, right?
Like all of them cats, though. Like every single
Mozart,
you
Paganini,
name any of them, they were like da-da-da-da. Nobody does that.
Yeah.
What are you doing? You can't do that to a piano.
But we see that music now as sublime, as angelic, as heavenly. But yet, you know what? Nazi soldiers would unwind with classical music after a hard day's work in the death camps.
Yeah, but I mean that's something made up. That's not.
But we bought
reality.
it and we like it, and especially Christians, we love that because that's the worldly music. And if you listen to Slayer, you're going to go out and you're going to kill everybody, and you're going to kill your parents, and you're going to you remember Sonic Youth, killing your parents, and they toyed with those ideas. And you know what? Not everybody that thought. Millions of people watched Taxi Driver, but there was one person, Hinckley, that went out and actually tried to kill the president. But for one person to do that, there's been millions that have done that as well. The Columbine killers were associated with Marilyn Manson. Just a few years, actually quite a while. We're getting old, but remember, they tried to blame Marilyn Manson that he influenced those boys to kill, and those boys didn't come from broken homes. Those boys were affluent. Those boys were wealthy. Those boys were rich. Things were not the Trenchcoat Mafia like we remember those things. Ozzy, Judas Priest, Two Live Crew, Slayer, rock and roll on trial, like all those things. So like
PMRC,
like you just can't blame it all on the music.
No, but we want a scapegoat.
Yeah, we've talked about that before.
We want to blame someone, and the one group we never ever want to blame is we don't want to turn inwardly.
They did that with this. Remember, he wouldn't show it for years and years and years with the film, right? Remember, Kubrick wouldn't show it in certain parts of the world, right? Because there were mock crimes, there were copycat crimes, because people saw the movie. And there was an awful sexual assault that was committed. And the boys were while they were committing the sexual assault, they testified that they were singing. They were doing the what was his name? Singing in the rain.
Singing in the rain.
Kelly, what was his name?
Just singing in the rain.
And those things change you, like that imagery. Like when I hear Gene Kelly, when I hear that song, like I don't think about the him, Fred Astaire, dancing around, swinging on the light pole with an umbrella. I don't think about that. No. I think about the awful images of Clockwork Orange.
Same.
Like I don't think about that. Like the other night, we were watching. My wife Heather was watching that Cold Case show, those reruns, and that song came on. I love you so. Please don't go. Remember, it was like a popular song. Don't go. And but because of Netflix and their interpretation of Jeff Dahmer, like every time I hear that song, like it ruins it. So like audio and visual images and sounds combined, they change our perception. They change the way we see the world. They change us, and it's not always for the best, but you can't blame it all explicitly, exclusively on that.
No.
But we tried to.
We try. I had heard, right, that, Gene Kelly, but I'd never.
Oh yeah, he was
seen-
angry about it.
I'd never seen Fred Astaire dancing, right?
Yeah.
The music video for me is exactly as you described. It was when I saw it in Clockwork Orange. Right?
Yeah, Alex.
There's a lot of songs that way that, like, before music videos existed, you just heard the song on the radio, and then you see it in a movie, and you have that association, because that's what we do. We gravitate toward association.
Yeah. Apocalypse Now with Sheen drunk in his underwear with Jim Morrison. Like, I'll never hear every time I see the end. Like, I'm gonna think about Sheen.
Yeah.
And that underwear.
That's
drunk.
an image to.
Yeah, but like, I'm hardwired that way. I grew up that way. The TV was my babysitter. Like, I grew up like that. So as we end, the totalitarian states, more laws and stiffer penalties prevent violent crime among youths. Clockwork Orange completely destroys that theory. It's a totalitarian state. And that is the point of the man, the bum, being abused and beat up in the alley, because he's like, I don't want us to live in this world anymore.
I don't want to live in this world anymore.
It's stinking kids like you, man on the moon, and all this kind of stuff. There's no law and order anymore because the government lets the kids get away with this stuff. And like the kids, I read about it. I read a lot of material about it as well, and they talk about how, like, the police were patrolling the streets, but the violent youth were patrolling the streets too. Yeah. And they were walking the streets, and they were looking for weak people, and they were looking for people that they could take advantage of, and they were, in a sense, they were keeping it clean. That's a terrible way to say it, but like they were patrolling, and they were doing their own policing.
To a degree,
and that's even happening now. Sure. Hence the man walking around with a ski mask. Yeah, so you see these patterns; they keep happening over and over again. And and I was thinking about literature, cinematography, visual images. I was thinking about Charles Starkweather. He was obsessed with James Dean and true crime magazines, because like true crime magazines in the 40s and 50s, like that was pornography, because they had these very explicit drawings of women that were tied up and bound, and people breaking into houses and all kinds of awful things like that. Like that was their pornography. And back then, society at large blamed the problems on Rebel Without a Cause, The Wild One, these wild movies, they're changing, Reefer Madness, they're changing our youth, they're corrupting our youth. We've got to put a stop to these films. We've got to put a stop to art. We've got to put a stop to literature. And like when you start doing those things, like it's very destructive, and like it doesn't work because it's not right.
Yeah, it doesn't end well at all.
So as we close, what are your thoughts? We're going to continue this Clockwork Orange series, and we're going to go more into the book, and we're going to hopefully try to make the connections with Scripture, the Bible, because the main emphasis of the book is the importance of free will, and that is a cornerstone of the Bible is free will. So these are very important ideas. They're very interesting ideas. So we started it with a question: rebellious youth, violent crime with the youth. Is it on the rise, or has it always been that way?
So I definitely think it's always been that way. Looking at the statistical data, in 1994, for example, the arrest rate was 477 out of 100,000, right? And there are so many more people on the planet today. There is so much more competition for resources. There are so many things that are publicized. There are so many things that are copycat. A lot of the stuff that we see is just offset by volume, right? Yeah. Like there is more. Like if 1 in 10 children are going to commit a crime, and instead of there being 100,000 kids, there are now 10 million kids. Well, by its extension, there's going to be more of it. But per capita, right, based on the number of people per thousand, right? Some of those numbers really haven't changed. And we have so many more kids that are doing so many wonderful and good things that we don't pay any attention to. Like kids that are inventing things, kids that are out, like, it was once in a while you had the kid on the street corner selling lemonade. Now you've got different fundraising platforms where kids are raising millions of dollars for causes that are important to them. You have people that are doing altruistic actions, sometimes true altruism, sometimes thinly veiled as, whatever. But we can't say nothing happens in a vacuum. We can't say that there is more crime without saying there is also more good being done.
And that's one of the things I miss about being away from Bible college, is because I used to see so many young people. They wanted to preach the gospel. They wanted to change the world for Christ. And I didn't grow up with kids that wanted to do anything like that, but it was so refreshing to be 30 years old or 35 years old and see a 19, 20-year-old kid or girl with an anointing that really wanted to make a difference for the kingdom of God. And I missed that.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you brought that up, because just because there are people that are always going to kind of be going the wrong direction, doing awful things, there is always good, because the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness could not put it out.
Hard to shine in the light, isn't it?
So we thank you for watching. Tune in, watch. If you have a comment, leave a comment, and we're going to keep going with A Clockwork Orange and the Bible. It sounds strange, but we're praying it will make sense. God bless you, and thank you.